We have another question.
You're talking about the debate, policy things. The one thing that's really upsetting me about this whole thing is what the government actually did. They now went, you talk about security and protecting everything, they went to an outside hacker, possibly, there's rumors they might have even had outside foreign government or foreign government corporations to try to hack a phone. So now potentially the whole big nightmare is about foreign cyber security, trying to hack into the United States. The FBI actually contacted foreign governments to help them. And once they have that technology now, how do we know they're not going to use it against us, for nefarious purposes? I have a major problem with the FBI doing in this case. With the hackers.
Well, but so
They should have, something.
Yeah.
The federal government had a lawsuit, and they should have gone through the lawsuit, not try to circumvent their lawsuit. And I have a major problem with that. If the courts ruled on the issue, probably would have gone to the U.S. Supreme Court, and that's the law of the land, and that's the legislature would have acted like you said. But going to an outside hacker sounds like a criminal, no offense, or possibly a foreign government. There's a lot of danger involved there, and I have a major problem with it.
well, I think there are a lot of hackers who aren't criminals, but who and I think Apple knows it and has discussed the fact that there are plenty of people.
Somebody trying to break into somebody's security, isn't that a crime?
There are criminal hackers and there are lawful hackers.
Yeah.
Hacking is an ethos. Hacking is a desire to break down. But
I think what Apple has said is that when the lawsuit was going on, they've said that look at what the FBI can do is try to hack in or try to get others to hack in. There's a whole community of hackers, and they said that's what will happen. And Apple further said that when that happens, we're going to try to find out how the hacker did it, and then we're going to fix that so the hacker can't do it again. And then we'll just go through it again and again and again. I think that's a bad result. I think it's like there should be a limit on it. I think that Apple shouldn't be able to benefit from the government's inability, temporary or longer or permanent, to get into information. I think that, as I've said, I think Apple should make it available under appropriate circumstances.
So let me pick up and take the opposite strand. So I agree that there's a problem with what happened for maybe overlapping reasons, but my primary concern is that one of the government's main obligations is to secure us against outside threat. And there are vulnerabilities in software that, when they exist, make us all vulnerable to all sorts of malicious actors. And when those are discovered by government, I think government has an obligation to fix them, and in the terminology that you'll hear hackers use, to responsibly disclose the vulnerability to the manufacturer so that they can patch it and issue an update. And the analogy that I like to use is if the government discovered that a criminal ring had built a master key that opened every single lock to every door in New York City, I would hope the NYPD would not sit on that key and allow us all to be vulnerable. I would hope that they would notify the manufacturer so that we all could be secure and not instead profit off of our collective insecurity.
So wait a minute, can I pick up on that?
Yeah.
So what should the FBI have done here? They now have information about, I'm assuming it's not yet public, about a criminal act, and maybe it shows Confederates or maybe it doesn't, but let's assume that they have investigative leads. Should they go and tell Apple, this is how we did it, you should fix it now, so that the next time these guys, we can't get in?
Absolutely. If you discovered that key, you would use it that one time maybe, but would you then allow us all to remain collectively insecure?
I'd like to keep it so that the next time a terrible terrorist act occurs, or a criminal act, or a common criminal, whatever you'll call it, we can get in and find out about it.
And every computer security professional you consult will tell you that that leaves us all collectively insecure and will eventually be exploited by a malicious actor. And that is the fact that there's not a single community security researcher who will tell you otherwise.
But, I've asked the question, and I don't, to some technologists, is it possible to tell me, because I think this is a balance, as we've said, how much more vulnerable are we by now that the FBI has gotten in? Is it theoretically that we're more vulnerable? Is it one, and if so, or is it 1 in a million? Will other hackers be able to do this in 10 years? If that's so, I'm not too worried about it. Will they be able to do it in 2 months? That's a bigger deal.
Yeah.
How can we answer that question?
So the two things. One is it depends, of course, on the nature of the vulnerability. And one of the one of the maxims you'll often hear from security researchers is that all vulnerabilities are shallow, which is to say none of them are terribly sophisticated. It's just a matter of you need to find them, because it turns out, an operating system like Apple's is probably millions of code, lines of code, and written by highly caffeinated hackers, in dark rooms late at night. There are vulnerabilities in the software we all rely on. But one of the reasons why the security researchers have a particular aversion to backdoors as opposed to your run-of-the-mill vulnerability is because backdoors represent single points of failure. They're not just mistakes. They're not things that you have to kind of guess and wonder whether they're there or not. They are single points of failure that once they're discovered, are extraordinary vulnerabilities. So for example, does everyone remember the Heartbleed vulnerability that was disclosed? I think it was last year. This was a flaw in one of the very foundational security protocols that we all rely on, whether you know it or not, to communicate securely with other websites. So when you go to a website and you see HTTPS and the little green lock, and you're like on Bank of America, for example, that tells you that it's a secure connection, so you can transact business without having to worry that someone is draining your bank account at the same time. That protocol, it was discovered, had a very elementary bug in it. A single line of code was repeated twice and could be exploited, it turns out, by anyone who had the desire to do it. It was discovered, widely reported, everyone in the security world now knows about it, and there are still systems out there that have not patched that vulnerability. Because once you have millions of devices running a particular piece of code, it's very hard to fix them all. It's very hard to patch them. That's why single points of failure are so, why they keep security professionals up at night.
But I guess I have two thoughts about that. One is, I think what I really want to focus on, at least because this problem has to sort of be dealt with incrementally, are iPhones. And I think it's or smartphones generally, because I think they're ubiquitous. I think they present a significant issue for law enforcement. And I don't believe that Apple ever had any hacking into the iPhones from 2006 to 2014, which would suggest that its prior system wasn't dangerously vulnerable. And furthermore, that this isn't like the hack of a website where you get tremendous number of people's data. As I said earlier, I think this is the situation where you need both the way in and the device itself, which is really going to prevent any widespread hacking. So I think that we should keep that situation different from others involving massive servers and government servers and whether those should be encrypted, which I think everyone agrees they should be.
So I think you actually have seen the breaches that you're talking about. When you hear of jailbreaking of iPhones, has everyone heard of jailbreaking of an iPhone? It's when you can install your own software on the iPhone. You make it so that it's more of a general purpose device as opposed to Apple's nicely walled garden. Jailbreaking is exactly that hack. In order to jailbreak an iPhone, you circumvent the protections that Apple has built into it, the protections you're talking about. And those techniques are out there, not as much for the latest ones, the very latest ones, but the reason why Apple has steadily advanced its security is because with just about every iteration of the iPhone, somebody has figured out how to jailbreak it, and once somebody has figured out how to jailbreak it, all of a sudden there is a market for stolen iPhones. Because when the technique exists to jailbreak, to take the device and do whatever you want with it, to circumvent its security, that's when the black market for stolen iPhones arises. Because I agree, the average person who steals an iPhone is not going to be able to figure out how to circumvent the encryption on it. But that's not how that market works. The way that market works is there's somebody who knows how to exploit the vulnerability. And because they know how to exploit it, they're willing to pay money for people who bring them stolen ones. And that's how that black market has historically worked. And that's why Apple has steadily increased their security, not as a result of the Snowden revelations, but going back, I think 2008 was the first time they made a significant advance in the security of their devices. But so I'll agree with you on this. It is a different question than the way in which vulnerabilities expose us when they are limited to the device versus data in transit. And I appreciate, I looked at your guys' public statement on this question, and I had not before appreciated that nuance in your position, and I appreciated it having seen it. But it turns out it's very difficult to limit hacking, to design a device in a way that a vulnerability can only be used in the way that you imagine it's going to be used. That's a principle called the nobody but us principle, which is how the NSA likes to think of its vulnerabilities. And it's a principle that most computer scientists think is is specious, because you can never rely on only the good guys discovering the vulnerability.
Again, I don't know that I can rely on that. I'd like to know how vulnerable is vulnerable. I think we need much more on that, and I think that it may be, in the case of iPhones, overstated.
Oh, we had another question.
Yeah, I guess I have two related questions. First of all, it seems like it's the classic use of criminals' benefit, right, to justify, well, the Fourth Amendment really shouldn't be that strong because it's harder for us to get information that criminals benefit from. So the question is, could any security device, right, whether it's a lock in a door, a safe, whether the government can compel the manufacturers of that device to create a specific weakness inherent that the government can then exploit? So can the maker of my door lock, be compelled to make it specifically weak so that the government, and somehow only the government, can use it? And you mentioned Rikers calls, which obviously on different sides of the New York prosecution defense bar, we don't necessarily agree they're properly recorded and used, but at least part of the theory...
That's a different debate.
At least part of the theory is that there's disclosure. There's a sign that maybe some people don't see or process, that everything is recorded and you shouldn't say anything on the phone, and they don't hear us when we say you shouldn't say anything on the phone. And that's told to people. So the FBI, if they had their way, nobody would have known that Apple had created a backdoor, right? This would have happened and it wouldn't have been the news. So can a company be compelled to do this and keep it secret? Or should there be some sort of disclosure requirement that, by the way, your iPhone could be subject to break-in by the government?
Well, I think, to take the questions in order, I don't think there's a device that the government can't get into, other than that I'm aware of, that it would try to get into on a regular basis for criminal law enforcement, that it can't get into. The question was asked at congressional testimony of Jim Comey, the FBI director. Well, what would happen if you had a safe that you just couldn't get into? And he laughed and he said, we'd find a way to blow that sucker up. And you know, the question
Apple's responsibility, I guess.
Okay, now whether it's Apple's responsibility or the government's, the two is a separate question. But I think that it's not a good idea, for the reasons I said earlier, in the case of iPhones, to have this arms race between Apple, private industry, and the government, because I think it'll take a long time for the government to get in, as it did in the San Bernardino thing. And that was a particular case of extraordinary public importance and publicity, and the government spent, it was reported, $1.3 million. We can't do that in every case. And you know, there are jurisdictions across the country where that just can't be done, and there are important cases across the country where we should get into it. I don't think there was ever anything secret about the fact that Apple could respond to search warrants. I think in courts every day for years, there was evidence introduced and testimony that this came via a search warrant, and officers testified, and Apple executives and Google, that they responded to search warrants and provided the information in them. So I don't think that was unknown to anyone. And in fact, as I said, when Apple introduced the iOS 8, they said, we will no longer be able to respond. So I think it was known.
Yeah, it was kept largely secret for some time, but then became very public. Apple has now said that they received about and complied with, I think, 77 or 80 of these orders from the federal government under what's called the All Writs Act, which is a First Judiciary Act law. Passed in the 1700s, and they were. We would. I just know because of an issue I followed very closely. You would kind of occasionally see glimpses of these documents, but never really see the full legal reasoning. And it first became, major public news actually when a prosecution in Brooklyn, investigators sought an order on the All Writs Act, compelling Apple to unlock a device. The magistrate judge assigned, who received that application, published an opinion saying, I am not sure you, federal government, have the authority you claim you do under the All Writs Act. Published that opinion, this was Magistrate Judge Orenstein, and sought Apple's response, and then issued a 50-page opinion finding that the government did not have that authority under the All Writs Act. That kind of preceded the San Bernardino, it kind of overlapped. It started before the San Bernardino investigation, but then the opinion came out after San Bernardino. But can I respond to two things? There is this, argument made frequently in the debate that the government has never had a device it can't get into. And I don't think that's the right way to think about the question of this access, because there has always been information the government has not had access to. because people have always been free to shred their papers, to burn their papers, to delete information, to have ephemeral conversations in person. And most of those conversations would be far more, I imagine, far more interesting for NYPD to look at than whatever someone happens to store on their phone. If I were an investigator, I would love to, bug every room so that anytime two co-conspirators spoke, I could have a record of their conversation. But we as a society have decided that that's not the world in which we want to live. We do not want to live in a world in which every aspect of our lives is fully transparent to government. And I think that's the right balance. I don't think everything should be fully transparent to government. And so it's not a question of because the information exists, should it be accessible, or it must be accessible. The question is, should it be? And what's the right balance in this context? And I think critical to understanding the balance in this context is also accepting that there's a vast amount of other information that is available to law enforcement as a result of technology. Technology has not been just a boon for criminals, although it of course has, in the same way that cars were a boon to criminals, but it has been a boon to investigators. And the other, just one minor thing, you refer to an arms race between Apple and the government, and I actually don't think it's an arms race between Apple and the government. I think it's an arms race between Apple and every criminal hacker out there. I think that's the reason why, again, I come back to it, why national security officials have said the threat of cyber attack is the single biggest threat to this country. And even if it's just a device, those devices hold an extraordinary amount of information. If you were a malicious foreign government acting in DC and you recovered the device of a politician, or you recover the device of somebody who worked in the financial industry or the healthcare industry, that device is going to have an incredible amount of sensitive information on it. It's going to be pulling in emails from servers from the government or from these financial institutions, and you want those devices to be secure. I think that is, to me, the essence of the debate.
I don't know how to answer without repeating myself. I mean, I don't think the fact that there's a lot of other information we have, it really means that, answers the question here. And in fact, as you said, these phones are extraordinarily rich sources of information, and they are for the reasons we all know, and they have information that is unique. And that may suggest that there should be limits on when we can get warrants. It may suggest there be limits on what they can obtain. I don't think but I also think, given the ubiquity of iPhones, given the a tremendous amount of information that they have that is available nowhere else, that they, as a matter of law, should not be immune from appropriate access.
Let me actually ask you a question about that. So you say, as a matter of law, they shouldn't be immune from access, but in fact, the legislation that the district attorney's office has proposed doesn't actually make it illegal. It simply penalizes, commercial sellers of the phone. So what would you envision other than that as the sort of legal mechanism to affect this change? Because as we've discussed, the Fourth Amendment doesn't take you there. It has to be some other. I
don't think the Fourth Amendment does. I think that there was a bill that was proposed by Senators Feinstein and Burr that would have required, I think, manufacturers of
anyone in the supply chain, really. It was a very broad bill, yeah.
To ensure that they were able to, if they received warrant, to get into the phone. And that, according to news reports, it didn't get very far, but these things sometimes take a long time. But I think that would be an appropriate response and an appropriate focus for debate.
All right, so we had a question in the back for a while.
It sounds to me like a little bit of this debate is what type of criminal should we be most worried about? Ben is talking about I don't want to say average criminal, but we have seen that there are homicides and kidnappings and terrorism cases that have been thwarted by our inability to get into phones. The other gentleman, I don't know.
Alex, yeah.
Alex's point is, well, there are these sort of super criminals out there that will really hurt our privacy and our security and so forth. To me, it sounds a little more speculative as to what you're saying, because we have specific examples of how cases have in fact been thwarted now and how our security has in fact been thwarted now. Your examples strike me as more like Ben was saying, the bigger cybersecurity types of cases. So to me, and I'm a prosecutor in case you haven't figured that out yet, that we have specific examples of cases where, especially in this world where we've been asked to make sure that we get it right the first time, that we do bring prosecutions, we bring it against the right people. Here we have a wealth of information that can allow us to make sure that we get it right the first time. We have the examples, so in weighing it in my eyes, to me, your concerns, which are terrifying, sound more speculative to me, whereas what Ben is talking about is cases that are happening every day all around this country where we cannot keep people safe.
So let me say two things in response. One is that I'm not sure we actually have a single case of documented investigation that has been thwarted by information that you would otherwise be able to access on the phone, and that's in part because I have read the report. I have read the report. Most of those are examples of instances in which information from a phone that was accessed proved useful, and other instances in which there was speculation about whether information on a device that they couldn't access might prove useful, even though, of course, you can't prove that it would be because the device is locked. So I don't think we have seen those, but I think we, on the flip side of that, in terms of the speculative nature of the cybersecurity threat, I can point to two things. One is that over the last 2 years, there have been major hacks of just about every major company out there that have revealed.
Oh, I'm not disagreeing with that, but
Yeah.
I'm talking about this particular time.
And those were right. Well, and those rely on device encryption, the very sort of device encryption that the proposal by the New York District Attorney would mandate that there be a backdoor into. Ben is focused on iPhones in the conversation today, but the legislation that the office has proposed is not limited to iPhones. It is directed at anyone who manufactures a device, which would presumably include Microsoft, which has created Windows, which has default encryption built into it for business customers, and I think they've expanded that more recently to other customers as well. And so that's data point one, which is that there are those major hacks. It's different than the iPhone. You're right. But it is related to the device encryption, which is what the bill that the district attorney has proposed. And the second is that don't take it from me, take it from every national security official who has said this is the #1 threat that is coming at this country, and the cornerstone of defense against that is strong encryption. And strong encryption, you deploy it in many different ways. It's not just on data at rest. It's also data in transit. It's not just on your iPhone. It's on a computer. But the entire.
I think that's broader than what Ben about just the phone. If we're just talking about the phone, I think what you're saying is broader.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how to say it otherwise, except for the fact that the people who store sensitive information on their phones, the people who store sensitive information are not just storing it on servers and the like. They're storing it on their phones. There are, I'm sure every member of Capitol Hill in DC uses an iPhone or an Android device, and I would not like that information to be less secure than it is. One problem we have right now, this is conceitedly different than what Ben has been talking about in DC, is that telephone communications are fundamentally insecure. They're not encrypted in a very strong way, and they can be eavesdropped upon using a device called a Stingray, which is basically a mobile cell tower. And there have been documented uses of Stingrays, they suspect, by foreign governments in DC, probably trying to listen in on members of government, which I think.
You can't listen in with a Stingray.
Yeah, I thought a Stingray was just.
No, you can listen in with a Stingray.
There's a question made me think of something, and I wonder, Dan, if I could ask you a question, which is,
Sure.
thanks. As the point is raised, sometimes getting this information helps us to exonerate or to inculpate. Someone in the Innocence Project who's concerned, and rightly, of course, with wrongful convictions, do you want us to have more information? And so wouldn't you say, gee, we should be able to get that?
Nobody's hiding exculpatory information.
Yeah, I think that to the.
But it helps us to get the right people.
You're just not going to get a search warrant for exculpatory evidence.
But the information is going to help us to understand the case, know who was involved and who wasn't involved.
Yeah, well,
And so won't that help?
I think the audience is. Thanks for chiming in. As I look desperately at my boss in the background. No, I think largely to the extent that people know that there's exculpatory information available, at least on their own devices, are going to make that available to the police through their lawyer. There's no question that there's no question that there may be circumstances under which, I may know that there's exculpatory information on so-and-so's phone and the government can't get it. And that may be a problem. These are hard questions for which there aren't easy answers. I don't know, partly because, the project is fundamentally backwards looking in terms of our exonerations. We haven't gotten there yet. I mean, we're exonerating people who were convicted in times in which, we weren't having this issue. I don't know it's hard for me to imagine forward in 20 years what it looks like where someone says, yeah, if only you had access to my co-defendant's iPhone, you would have known that I was innocent.
I could certainly imagine cases where you'd say, look, he's not talking about it, he's not giving you the information. There should be information that would show I wasn't involved.
I mean, that may well be true. I don't know that answers some of, and I should say, the Innocence Project, I think, has no position on encryption whatsoever. So these are certainly my own views. That may be the case. I don't know that answers any of the other sort of fundamental questions about security writ large. But it's always...
No, what it goes to is the value of being able to get into the phone. Yeah. Okay. Just curious.
So we had another question over here for... No?
My question is, you want to propose legislation to have Apple allow the backdoor. Basically, is Apple's changing its operating system. I have now my iPhone 6 right here, $6. I like it. One of the reasons why I bought my iPhone 6, because I like the privacy that iPhone has. But let's say now iPhone, when I get, I always get those updates, the operating system, and they keep changing the operating system. Let's say I know it's advertising. So the operating system, let's say like a number 11.2. That's where they change. With an operating system, there's no more. It rectifies the thing that you want to rectify. I decide to say, something, screw that. I don't want to do it. I'm not going to download it. I'm not going to accept it. And I cheat. So under your proposal, potentially then, because federal law ordered Apple to change the operating system, and I decide not to change the operating system, not to accept that update, am I committing a crime by doing that? Or anybody on the street doing that, if they decide not to accept the Apple update, change the operating system, allow now Apple to have the back door. You already have a very big Pandora's box here.
I think the answer is you're not, but you have to look at the legislation. And I think that the expectation would be that just most people would, because presumably the updates are better and better and people want them. But there are always people who are going to want different things. There are some people who don't probably use iPhones or cell phones because they don't want to be tracked or any other number of things. They want that security, and they're not committing crimes.
The question is, if you're mandating Apple to do it, and basically you're saying, Apple, you must do it.
Yeah.
What happens to people actually on the phones and they refuse to accept it? Is there a problem? Is that over there?
You'd have to look at the legislation. I don't think that would, can't imagine, frankly, that would incriminate anyone who chose not to do it.
Assume that you'll have a decline option.
With the Apple updates, I have the option now to reject all Apple updates.
For all the updates except that.
All right.
You actually do. You're required to type in your password to actually install an update in a way that kind of cryptographically verifies that it's you installing the update. So you could actually always, refuse. But.
Got another question.
This might be covered, but just empirically, the world didn't end prior to the application of this encryption on the iPhone. So if you look at the historical data, dams weren't opened and people weren't destroyed as a result of, pre-encryption Apple phones. So why is it now that the encryption is there, that the encryption is broken, the world will?
That's directed at me.
Yeah.
I think the reason is because the rise of cybersecurity threat. There's a.
Encryption go in place?
There's been modern encryption available since about the 70s.
No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the specific encryption that was the
2010.
No, October 2014. No, I think what you're referring to, what I've referred to as impregnable encryption.
Yes, impregnable encryption.
October 2014 or early 2015.
So prior to October 2014, there was cyber criminals, there was cyber threats. rogue nations and just adversary nations
Yep.
existed. The world didn't end. But for some
Well, I don't think anyone's claiming the world is going to end, but
it sounds like that.
well, I apologize for giving that impression, but there have been every.
Maybe my cognitive bias.
Well, maybe it's my poor reciting of the national security official's warnings, but the warning is that cybersecurity or cyber attacks are on the rise. They're the single biggest threat to our nation, and if you study the attacks that are written about in the news, you'll quickly see that every week companies have had the information of millions of their customers breached, and prior to there was actually impregnable encryption prior to 2014. It just didn't cover the same amount of information on the iPhone. It covered a different set of information. What Apple did in 2014 was extend that container to include more information.
That don't have, so there are people who don't have iPhones. These other phones have impregnable encryption.
Is the Android?
The Android, you can turn it on if you want. I don't think it's on by default.
All right, but once again, so
Yeah.
post-October 14, 2014, everybody else with a non-impregnable encryption iPhone, once again, just kind of continue with my hyperbole. The world has an end.
Right.
The criminals who are doing robberies and murders and kidnapping.
They're stealing those phones and they're stealing those phones and they're exploiting the information on them. Sorry.
The people who are committing these crimes that Chris Hammond referred to, kind of average crimes, are still shooting people up and kidnapping people, and in some instances involving mass killings. And so as society balances the doomsday, we don't all have impregnable encryption, the world will come to an end, versus there's a lot of problems right now, just with people being victimized. Just wondering where the balance.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm not trying to claim the world is going to end. That's not my claim. My claim is that information security is a new threat, and encryption is the cornerstone to protecting our information. And prior to the encryption that was made available on these devices in a very easily and in some cases default manner, people's devices, when they were stolen, had their information exploited. I mean.
It's been going on.
All right.
It's going on for a while.
I'm not claiming the world is going to end as a result of that. That's not my characterization. I'm just saying that is a problem and it's a rising one. And if the other thing you should, that's worth being aware of as you look at the news when you study cyber attacks, is that the ones that are reported are just the tip of the iceberg. Companies are not under any obligation to publicly report when they have the information of millions of their customers compromised. And so the ones that we learn about are just the tip of the iceberg, and even those are concerning enough as it is.
I think a lot of them are phishing as opposed to necessarily description.
Okay, we're going to move along. There's a question in the back.
A commercial question. There are locksmiths all over the city, and yet I still lock my door. Foolish. The locksmith will walk away to get in there in a matter of minutes, if that will. Apparently, there was a fairly well-paid locksmith who took my taxpayer dollars and learned how to open the Apple super encryption. It became pregnant. That locksmith got paid. Well, the next time somebody really wants to open an iPhone, hire the guy.
Yeah.
With the appropriate warrants, similar to those which would be handed to the locksmith on the corner if the DA wanted to open my front
And I
door.
think the problem with that is that the cost was reported to be $1.3 million, and I'm not going to be able to pay that for every case that I have, and there are real victims in our cases.
Well, how much does it cost to run DNA? How much does it cost to hire an expert to investigate what may be an arson scene? We know there was a fire.
Yeah.
But was it arson? How much does it cost to get somebody who knows what he's doing? How much does it cost to maintain a good, accredited state crime lab with properly trained and certified personnel? Yeah, if it's a good case, you'll spend the bucks.
Well, I think there are plenty of cases that are good cases that we need the information and sometimes need it very quickly. And I just think it's not a good answer or an efficient answer or a good answer from purposes of administration to say, well, let's just outsource that and have people who are locksmiths who can charge almost extortionate rates.
At least,
Locksmiths to get into a door with a really good
Okay.
lock or a safe that is properly, a really good bank safe that may have a couple of 100 kilo of white powder substance and some explosives and some weapons in it. Would you pay a really good locksmith to pump that if you have the warrants?
You know, I think is part of the argument, Ben, that we don't know, you know, if it costs us $1.3 million every time we want to open a phone, we may not know what's in it. I mean, you may be,
We have
you know,
probable
if
cause
you
to
have this-
believe, right.
certainly, you may have probable cause.
Which is
but
all they had,
probable
right.
cause means
It may be there, it may not be there, that's right.
And it really, the $1.3 million, it seems to me, was paying him to develop the key. Seems like you must have a copy of that key now.
Well-
I can't believe the next time will be 1.3.
The FBI does have a copy. Whatever it is, and it wasn't actually 1.3 million. That was Comey made a joke that the amount they paid was more than he earned collectively during his time at the FBI, and so somebody did the math and reported 1.3 million. They then came back and said that wasn't actually the number, but they haven't disclosed what it was. It was unquestionably a significant number, but it wasn't $1.3 million. And they did keep a copy of it, and they said they would use it in other cases, but they were reportedly not sure how many other phones it would work on, because it was developed specifically, I think, for an iPhone 5C, which is what the phone was at issue in San Bernardino, running a particular operating system, I think iOS 8 or 9. So, you know, vulnerabilities tend to be specific to devices and software, and this one may have worked on a similar device, but may not have worked on a different device.
And just to clarify, the FBI did not actually decrypt the phone. They did not, as far as we understand it, did not actually decrypt it, but were able to bypass some of the security features that enabled them to run, you know, password permutations until they happened upon the password that opened the phone. Because your phones, most of them have some sort of protection that prevents people from doing that, and they were able to circumvent that. But the encryption itself wasn't broken, which may not be of any moment, but is part of the sort of discussion that we're having. I think we may have run out of time, so I just want to thank our panel for a really great, robust debate.
Nice to meet you.